Texas. Hey, Debbie.
Oops. Okay, she can't hear you. Talk into here. Okay. Hello, Debbie. And hello, Joe, who texted me this afternoon from Maryland, who says she's going to be streaming and had questions. So anyway, John, we're good to go. If you are, here is our material for tonight. And just very honestly, I will say this to you. I think this may be my favorite class so far. Not because of the quiz that we're going to do in the next about 1 minute and 30 seconds, but because of the topic. And so I hope you're blessed by it. So several reminded me, I might say, or if I were to be more accurate, I would probably say they reprimanded me for handing out the quiz last week and not going over the quiz. So we're going to give you the answers to the quiz pronto. But first of all, we're going to talk to you about what we're doing today. And here's our outline. So that's a lot of material, starting at Bethany, the temple, Mount of Olives, upper room, Kidron Valley, Mount of Olives, 2 times, Garden of Gethsemane, house of Caiaphas, the church of the Rooster, to Pilate, to Via Dolorosa. And we're going to talk about what that word means. What is Via Dolorosa? Who speaks that kind of language? And then the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. And it's almost sacrilegious to say it all that quickly. But anyway, that's what we're doing today. And this is part 2 of Jerusalem. So I promised we'd start off with the lessons or the questions from last time. The 2 primary preferences. Oh, let me just go ahead and give you here they are. All the answers right there, okay? But we're going to talk through them real briefly and maybe elaborate just momentarily. 2 primary passages that reinforce the authenticity or the believability or the reliability of Scripture, and we can embellish this a whole lot more at another time. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, and 2 Timothy 3, 16 and 17, and 2 Peter 1, 20 and 21. We read both of those passages last week, so we're not going to do it this week. And note number 2, the Bible is made up of 66 different books. And I'm going to give you a little memory aid. There are many advantages of being raised in the church or raised in a church that teaches the Bible. And one of them has been, I learned this when I was a preschool kid. Before I even entered 1st grade, I knew there were 66 books in the Bible, and I've never forgotten that. They were written over, and I didn't know this, they were written over of a period of, depending on who you talk to, but 1,500 to 1,600 years in all probability. There's a little bit of a question about Job, and there's a little bit of a question about the Pentateuch when it was first written, and then we obviously go up through the end of the book of the New Testament, that Revelation, which is most would agree was written about 90 A.D. There were 40 different individuals or people who wrote, and there are 39 books of the Old Testament and 27 books of the New Testament for a grand total of 66 books. And how do you remember 39 and 27? Well, you just remember 3 times 9 is 27. Now you know not only how many books there were in the Old and in the New, but how to remember. 3 times 9 is 27. Now, probably you knew this before we even started the class. The Old Testament is primarily written in what language? Hebrew. And the New Testament was primarily written in Greek. And when you put all these together into a collection, the books of the Bible were collected and arranged, ultimately recognized as inspired. This was this process of deciding what was in and what was out is called the canonization, or the development of the canon, C-A-N-O-N, which is a measuring. It's how you measure what's supposed to be in and what's not supposed to be in. And there were many different books that contended to get in, but there were different they're not called conferences. That was right on the end of my mind. What's the word? There were different, it'll come to me a little bit later. Pardon? The edict of, anyway, we'll come to it. Different meetings of church officials, but I still don't have the technical word. Then little by little, they eventually came to the canon as we know it now over a period of about 300 years. Before the printing press, how was the Bible reproduced? Handwritten. Every single page had to be written by human hands. So to have a copy of the Bible was very expensive, and if you had a copy, unlike pretty much everybody in this room who has 3, 4, 5, 8, 10 Bibles, if you had a part of a book, you were doing well. The first Bible, or the first book, get this, ever printed on Gutenberg's printing press was the Bible. It was printed in 1455, and here's a trick question. What language was Gutenberg's first Bible printed in? Printed in Latin, yes. Of the thousands of copies of the New Testament written by hand before 1500 AD, how many Greek manuscripts of the New Testament exist today? I need to clarify that question just a little bit. How many partial or full copies of the Greek manuscripts? So some of these would be merely fragments. They would be parts of books or parts of manuscripts, and the number is 5,300. What discovery that was made in the middle of the 20th century helped to confirm the astonishing reliability of the Old Testament text? And again, no New Testament text were found in the Dead Sea Scroll. That's important to realize. This was all confirming the legitimacy, the authenticity of the Old Testament, and those were called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And on our upcoming trip there, we will visit Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Although the Bible has been translated into hundreds of languages, there are still about how many groups of languages or language groups that do not have the Bible in their own language, and that number is about 3,000. So what we take for granted and have, like I said earlier, maybe 6, 8, 10 copies of in our homes, there are a lot of people that don't even have the first copy. It's not even translated into their Bible yet. By AD 200, the Bible was translated into how many different languages? And so it tells you how important it was seen, because by about a century after Christ lived and the New Testament was written, it was already being widely dispersed, and so into 7 different language groups by the end of the 2nd century. Yes?
Weren't Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in some caves?
They were.
Why are they called Dead Sea Scrolls?
Because they were found, the caves, the question is, why were the Dead Sea Scrolls called, since they were found in caves, why were they called the Dead Sea Scrolls? Because the caves that they were found on were on the banks of the Dead Sea. Okay? And if you had been at every class, you would have already remembered that. So we're not gonna talk about that anymore. But but I'm just glad you're here tonight. That was a good question, because probably somebody else had wondered that and was afraid to forget it or afraid to ask it. So, Angel, in all seriousness, I love to say, and I mean this, the only bad question you can ask is the question that you had and you don't ask. So thank you for asking, yes. Okay, so we're going to do the first 6 or 7 slides here are going to be a review of what we've covered so far to catch everybody up to date. Crossroads of the ancient world. Why is Israel, this part in here, so important? It was the crossroads of the ancient world, particularly coming from down in here, up into here, when there were wars to be fought, when there were trade routes to be guarded. Right there in the middle is what we today call Israel, and that's where all this is happening. And so it would kind of be like JFK Airport for world travelers today. The whole world comes to the U.S. or wherever they're going through JFK or LAX, whichever, okay? So there you go. That's why it's so important, and it was important in the first century. We covered this. When you say, how much rainfall did they have in Israel? Well, it depends where you are in Israel. So up in the northern part of Israel, this area up in here, they will have as many as 45 inches of rain a year. Down towards the central part, 42 inches, about like Philadelphia, as you can make your way on down, or like Los Angeles, 12 inches. But when you get down in here below the Dead Sea, where are we here? Yeah, right in here, you might have 4 inches. It's desert area, okay? You with me there? You know what, I'm going too fast and not keeping up with my own notes. I love this slide. I love not only where it was taken, but I also love what it shows us today. So this slide taken by NASA, and this is what this area looks like from space. So here you have the Mediterranean Sea over in here. Here you have the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River coming right down here, and here you have the Dead Sea. Here you have modern day Israel, and along in here you have the Gaza Strip, and over in here you have the country of Jordan, and then up in here is Syria and Lebanon. So that's what it looks like if you were going to visit today, okay? Let me go back one slide and talk about this. See, it looks like there's a big rift in here, big valley area. Well, it's bigger than that. This is just what we see here. So this is called literally the Great Rift. And it starts down here in Africa, comes right on up through modern day Israel, separating Israel and Jordan. And so just like out west we have faults. This is a fault that comes also from Africa up into the Middle East. It's called the Great Rift. Tectonic plates pulling apart little by little. On each of the last 3 trips that we've done on, there's been at least one person on each trip that wanted to be baptized. Sometimes we've had more. And here is our trip from several years ago. One of the ladies that was with us wanted to be baptized in the Jordan River. And so today there are 2 sites in the Jordan River where you would do a baptism. One is up in the central part of Israel, what it would be about parallel to Jerusalem, although obviously Jerusalem is not at the Jordan River. And then one is way down at the southern part, and we've done baptisms at both places. This time, this one here that we were visiting 3 years ago, or 3 trips ago, is extremely commercialized. And so if we can, we will avoid that one and go to the other one, which is more likely the place where Jesus was baptized, at Bethany beyond the Jordan. It's not nearly so commercialized, and if you're baptized in that river, way on down, you'll get mud between your toes. It's real slow moving and real muddy down there. So anyway, but we will do baptisms if any on the group want to have enjoy a baptism. Pardon me? Commercialized is, okay, the question is define commercialized. This one here is commercialized. It's got handrails to walk down. It's got cement. There is a fee, a minimal fee of like, I think it's $3 or $5 per person, so it's not expensive. And that is to get a garment. If you want to take your own garment, there's no charge. So that's what I mean commercialized. So this is the commercialized one. You see the metal rail there, whereas the other one, way down Bethany beyond the Jordan, it's wooden, and there's nothing to walk down. There's no cement, and when you get in there, you get mud squeezing between your toes. Okay. No critters in these waters, no. At least I've never seen any, yeah. It's not scary. So here we are today, and I've talked about that already. We're focusing especially on the last week of Jesus' life. So anyway. Okay, and this is a little bit of a review from last week too. Remember last week we talked about Jerusalem. That was part one. But I didn't show you this slide here last time, so I want to highlight the areas over here. This is the Temple Mount, and we showed pictures of that. This is near where we would have seen the Wailing Wall, right along in here, okay? And then you have the Kidron Valley. Kidron Valley is mentioned many, many times in the Gospels. You have the Kidron Valley, then from Jerusalem, you cross the Kidron Valley and get to the Garden of Gethsemane. I'm going to be showing you lots of slides of the Garden of Gethsemane, which is not a traditional site. It is the real site where Jesus would have prayed the night of his betrayal. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So to me, it's one of the most solemn sites that we visited, to know Jesus walked in this area. So that's the Garden of Gethsemane. And the Garden of Gethsemane, if I may say this, is kind of right on the bottom of the hill of the Mount of Olives. And so the Garden of Gethsemane, if you walk on up it, it would lead up to the top of the Mount of Olives. And over here, about a mile away, is Bethpage and Bethany. And this aerial map is just a real good one to show how close the proximity is between each of these. Bethany, John chapter 11, verse 1, is the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Also the home of Simon the leper. And so you can see how close these are to each other. I want to talk about this one just a little bit again today, the Old City. Remember that we talked about there were 4 quadrants, or there are 4 quarters in the Old City of Jerusalem. The city was divided after the War of 1947, and following the Arab-Israeli War, the Old City was captured first by Jordan, and the Jewish residents were evicted. But during the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel captured the Old City and all of East Jerusalem. Today, Israel controls the entire area, and Israel's annexation of eastern Jerusalem is not recognized by the UN. So the United Nations frowns on that. We'll talk about that a little bit more the very, very last week of this series. Rather, the international community, the UN, sees Jerusalem as Palestinian territory, even though the war is over. Okay, maybe that's enough about that. Yeah, that's kind of a good breakdown of all that I just said to you. And then the same year that we took our last tour, which was 2 years ago, President Trump moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was a symbolic act and caused more than a little angst among much of the world. As it turned out, it was no big deal, but there was threat of great violence. I say it was no big deal. There was no loss of life as a result of it, yeah. Okay, so here's Jim Bailey, who was with us on our trip 4 years ago, sitting on the temple steps. This is just outside the Old City, and that gives you kind of some perspective as how big this place is, Jerusalem. And we're going to look at the Mount of Olives now. Again, you've got Jerusalem, the Kidron Valley, and then the Mount of Olives. And all of these are references to scriptures that talk about the Mount of Olives. Jesus went out to the Mount of Olives. It seems like, you know, I don't know about you, but a lot of us will have our closet, our quiet place, a place where we want to get away from things. For Jesus, at least when he was in and around Jerusalem, it seems as though the Mount of Olives is where he would go to. When they drew near to Jerusalem, right in here, and came to Bethpage and to the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples. Matthew 26, when they sang a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. And again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I know it took me a while to really get this straight in my head. The Kidron Valley, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the Mount of Olives. That's the way you'd go from Jerusalem. He came out and went, as it was his custom, to the Mount of Olives. His disciples followed him. This was kind of one of his go-to places. He sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Peter and John and Andrew asked him privately. So what we're saying is this is a place where Jesus frequented. And I don't know, why did I put that on there a second time? Was there something more I wanted to say about that? Yes, there was. It continues through Judean wilderness, this Kidron Valley, towards the Dead Sea, and it descends from Jerusalem down to the Dead Sea. There's a 20-mile road or 20-mile course that you would take, and it descends 4,000 feet. So Jerusalem is up high, and the Dead Sea is down low. And so that's why I wanted to talk about the altitude. And so over and over again, when you hear about Jesus going up to Jerusalem, it's not that he went north, it's that he went up in altitude. And I think that's probably pretty well known. Pretty much every place you will go, there will be an opportunity for tourists to ride a camel. The price can be anywhere from $2 to $5, depending on how desperate the person is that's wanting to give the ride and how long your ride lasts. But in most cases, it's just a chance, get up on the camel, walk around a little circle, not even a block, but I mean walk around for 30 or 40 steps and then get back down. But it's a great tour. It's a great shot to have, and I think well worth the $5 or whatever it is. This one here was at the Mount of Olives. And yeah, so there will be that opportunity. Also on the Mount of Olives, so here we are standing, this picture is taken standing on the Temple Mount, so standing near the old city of Jerusalem at the wall, looking across the Kidron Valley, which would have been right down in here, looking up to the top of the Mount of Olives, which is right up here. And this church right here is called the Church of All Nations. The Church of All Nations is located on the grounds, on the actual site of the Garden of Gethsemane. And we'll talk a little bit about the Church of All Nations, why it was built there, who built it, and why it is significant there. Basically, I'll give you a little heads up. 12 different countries contribute to building this chapel or this church as a sign of unity, that all these different countries wanted to participate in a show of unity to say people from all these different countries are supporting, yes, we are Christian, we believe in this, and we want our country to be a part of it. Okay, now we're going to go for a minute, and we'll come back to a little bit more of the earlier parts of Jerusalem, to the room of the Last Supper. This is another one of those, I would just call it a misnomer. It's a misidentification in that this is not the room where Jesus would have had the Last Supper. I'll just tell you that way. Because that room was destroyed when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. The whole city was destroyed. And so what this is what we're going to see is a house that was built on the site where they think the upper room would have been located, okay? This is guesswork. The house would have been probably belonged to a wealthy person. In that day, the wealthy people lived on the top floor, and the animals and the servants lived down on the second floor. And so this is a house that was eventually converted into a church, and it served as a church for a while, which is what they did, the early Christians did. When I say early, I'm talking about early centuries, 300, 400, 500 AD. Any place they found a spot that they might think Jesus might have done a miracle, where he might have preached a sermon, they would build a church to preserve it. And so the room of the Last Supper was for a while a church. Mark 14, 15, he will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready, there prepared for us. So this is where Jesus would have eaten the Last Supper with his disciples. Again, not this one that we're going to look at, but one like this, and probably on the same site. And then this is probably where, a large upper room, the disciples in the book of Acts gathered. Acts chapter 1, when the Holy Spirit fell upon them as they were waiting for the pouring out of the Holy Spirit. So that's Acts 1:13, where Jesus said to the disciples, "You wait here in Jerusalem." And they did wait. How many days between Christ's crucifixion and the day of Pentecost? Anybody remember? More? Pentecost? 50. Like a pentagon is five-sided, and it was from Passover to Pentecost was 50 days, right, Lawyer Larry? Yeah, so anyway. So this is what it looks like today. Very ornate. Nothing else in there. But again, wonderful acoustics. If you want to sing a song in here, and if your group is the only one in here, you're allowed to sing a song in what is traditionally now called to be the upper room. But again, I need to say, it wasn't this one because that was destroyed already. It was one that was built on the side. So, unless you have a good guide, or unless you have someone who is traveling with you with great integrity and knows something of history, this would be presented to most tour groups as the upper room. But it's not really, because the upper room was destroyed. Now, you go from that traditional site to just outside of there, from the upper room, you can walk across the Kidron Valley on these old steps. And so these, I believe, and many scholars agree, and I believe this because many scholars agree, would have been the steps that Jesus walked down as he left the upper room and walked across the Kidron Valley to the Jordan, or to the Garden of Gethsemane. So we went from that last side, the upper room, which we know was not authentic, to these steps, which go to the right time period and are in the same location. So they very well may have been the steps that Jesus would have walked down. I told you we'd talk a little bit more about the Church of All Nations, so this is where Jesus would have walked, down those steps, across the Kidron Valley to the Church of All Nations, and this is what it looks like from up close. Again, on both sides of the church, you have the Garden of Gethsemane, and most tourists gather over in here, and we will have extra time there. The Church of All Nations was built in 1924, and 12 different countries, churches from 12 different countries, donated monies, donated funds to build it, and according to tradition, the altar of the church was claimed to be at the exact site where Jesus prayed. Now that's where I'm like, well, I'm just happy to be in the garden. I'm not saying that this was the exact site, but the altar inside of this church is way up in the back half, is where the tradition says Jesus would have prayed the night the soldiers came to take him. So again, that's tradition. So you've got this ongoing mix and tug of war between what is known and what is certain, and lots of legend, lots of tradition. And so we try to always separate that so we'll know for sure. It's kind of like what we today call fake news. You know, hey, this is fake news. It's not really here, but it would be portrayed as being here. So this is, and again, this is the Garden of Gethsemane. And when we say garden, we today typically think of a decorated area. But in the first century, it wasn't a decorated area. Angie, you're from Puerto Rico.
Yeah, my mother had a beautiful garden.
Had a garden, but it wasn't a decorated garden. This is where you'd have in Puerto Rico, you'd have your coffee or your whatever, your coffee beans or your coffee trees. That's a farm? Okay. Well, a lot of places where she had, okay. Okay, so she did have, but a lot of places of the world, if you go to the garden, you're not going to a fancy decorated garden with flowers, but rather if you're going to the garden, you're going to where you farm. Yes. And so this is what it looks like today. Seriously doubt that it looked like this in Jesus' day. But we do know that there were olive trees there. a large cistern for holding water, which would have held 250,000 gallons, was found beneath the garden from the time of the Crusades. So you're talking 1,000 years later. But like farmers today need irrigation, well, they had to have somewhere to keep these olive trees going well. Here's more of the olive trees from the garden. Very, very old. And again, some guides will tell you these were the trees that were alive when Jesus was here. That's a big stretch. Number one, olive trees typically don't live to be that old. And number two, when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, they destroyed everything. So it may have been roots from the trees that were there. This one is claimed to be 2,000 years old. However, olive trees don't have rings in them like all of our trees. They don't grow with rings. And so when you have an olive wood carving that some of us will bring back, I've got several of them in my office, you're not going to see rings like you would see a ring. So it's hard to determine the actual number of years old that these olive trees are. So this is the garden. So we're going to move from this garden to another garden. This is a garden where we did stop, and we will again stop for just a time of reflection, a time of meditation, a time of scripture reading, usually from the Gospels, and a time of prayer. I'm trying to think, oh yeah, some of us, there's Catherine, and there's Judy Campbell, and some of you know Jim and Carol Bailey, Hope Hooley, some of you remember Hope, and then who else? Those are all the names that some of us here would remember, okay? Okay. Now, we're going from the Garden of Gethsemane to the Garden Tomb, still in Jerusalem, but separated by a mile or two. So, this is a tomb, a Jewish tomb, that we do believe dates from the 1st century, okay? Obviously without the cinder blocks that you see here. That was added later. And we're going to get inside of that tomb in just a moment. In fact, right along in here is a trough that a large stone could have been rolled in front of the tomb and then sealed. A large flat stone which was circular. This actual location right here was unearthed in 1867 by a scholar by the name of Gordon, Gordon. He was a British archaeologist, and so this is, in everyday jargon today, this is called Gordon's Tomb right here. And since 1894, the tomb and the gardens right around it have been maintained as a quiet garden for reflection by an organization based in the United Kingdom called, get this, very creative, the Garden Tomb Association. So our regular Israel guide that will be traveling with us the whole time, he won't give the tour once we get inside of here. He will not. He's not permitted. There is structuring. It will be a representative of the Garden Tomb Association, who will speak in all probability with a very sharp British accent, because they are the ones that manage the Garden Tomb. So what does one of these tombs look like if you get inside? Okay, so this is a diagram of the tomb. One, you had the entrance chamber. That's the part we saw right back here. Two, you have a low threshold to get into the burial chamber, which is over here. Three, you have the low rock walls that would separate the burial chamber from the main chamber. A slit for a vertical slab of stone, which would have gone from right in here. You can see the 5 mark there. The weeping chamber is right out here. So you would bring your dead into the tomb, put them in the inner tomb, and then you'd be out here to grieve. That's called the weeping chamber. And then number 7, there was a small wall or a small hole that was there. And so this very much fits the design of Gordon's tomb right here. Of course, like I said, in the late 1800s, this was rebuilt right here. But one of the things that we always do every time we're here is every person that wants to is able to climb up these little steps here and walk inside and see a tomb that some claim Jesus was buried in. I will claim it was a tomb like this because they rolled a stone in front of it. I will not claim this is the tomb, although geographically it could be. This is just one of the sites. The Catholic Church thinks they have the tomb, which is another place, and it's built, and we're going to look at that in just a minute, at a place called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is, once again, remember I mentioned earlier, they would find religious sites and they would build churches on top of them. So the Roman Catholic Church, they don't believe this is where Jesus was buried at all. They think he was buried in a tomb, and they built a church over it called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, okay? So here you go on the inside now. So the big slab that would have gone right along in here, it's missing. It broke. But this would have been where the body was laid. And then over here on this side was the weeping chamber. I don't have that pictured here. So that'll give you an idea of what that would have looked like. And you remember Joseph of Arimathea took the body of Christ off the cross. He was buried at Golgotha, which means place of the skull. And when you are visiting this tomb right here, you can look across a little valley, and you will see a traditional site of Golgotha, place of the skull. If you use a little imagination, you can see what today looks like a skull. See the nose piece, the eye, everybody see that? Yes? Yeah. So it's hard to imagine it because today, from that tomb over to the place of the skull, there's a big commercial bus yard with diesel buses running. So it's not very romantic or very spiritual feeling, but this is, by legend, by some people's thought, the place where Jesus would have been buried or where he would have been killed up on top of this area right here. And but of course, erosion, things happen. That was 2,000 years ago, but this is a site that's been by many for the last 200 years at least thought of as place of the skull, okay? One of the things that we are usually able to do as well at the Garden Tomb is we will have communion there. Obviously voluntary. When we were there with a group that Jim Bailey was with, and he is the one that I'm borrowing a large number of these slides from. This was a class he did years ago. We were there on a Sunday afternoon, and so we had our own communion service. And we have, our group has its own little, if you will, chapel right on that side, and we'll obviously have, I think there's 30 minutes set aside for us to just be there and have communion, have scripture reading, and quiet meditation time. Okay. I told you earlier that we were going to have another look back up at near the upper room. That was the one that we pictured earlier. And another building. This is all one day of a walking trip. And so any given day we may walk if you want to. You don't have to do all these steps, as many as 5 to 8 to 10,000 steps. And so, but there's always breaks in between, so you're not going to walk all that in one day. So here we are at the pit at Caiaphas' house. Caiaphas was a high priest at that time, and we're actually at this point standing down in the pit, which is beneath Caiaphas' house. It was an area that had been carved out into what, for all practical purposes, was a prison. Matthew chapter 26, 57 through 67, Caiaphas and the chief priest and the Sanhedrin, they are interrogating Jesus. They are accusing him with false evidence. They are trying to frame him but they're unable to find anything. And so what does Caiaphas do? He throws him in prison for a while before he can send him over to Pilate. And so this is where this, or a place like this, is where Jesus could have been thrown. And here we are now at the bottom. I'm looking up, and so how would they have gotten a person into the pit? There was a hole. And how they would get you in there, into the pit, they might have just dropped you in, a drop of about 20 feet to the floor, or our guides, both 3 times that we've been there, said more often than not, if it was a prisoner that they wanted to keep alive, they would wrap ropes around him and lower him into the cave, but you weren't going anywhere there. You were in there once you were in there. And so after they'd gone through a mock trial for Jesus, obviously the Jews didn't have the authority to kill Jesus. They had to have the authority to kill Jesus from the Romans. And so they took him out of this pit, or one like this, and they sent him to Pilate, because Pilate was the only one that had the authority to offer the death penalty. And that's what the Jews, that's what the scribes and Pharisees wanted. Now, reminds me of Psalms 88. You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions of dark and deep. I think a prophetic psalm looking to the coming of Jesus, okay? So the pit there, let me go back to that one. The pit in the floor leads up to Caiaphas' house, and they would have taken Jesus out of there after they first tried him and then sent him over to Pilate. Okay. If I were Peter, I wouldn't have wanted a church built where I denied Christ. But there is a church built, the Church of the Rooster, in Jerusalem. On this supposed location, a church was first built in 457 AD. Okay? It was destroyed and rebuilt several additional times, and this church right here was finally completed in 1931. And when the cock crowed, Peter realized the seriousness of his denial, and he wept bitterly. And you can read that whole story, not that you're not familiar with it, in Matthew chapter 26, verses 69 through 75. Who built that church was the question. Basically, the 4 major religious groups, Christian groups that are active today in Israel are, of course, the Roman Catholic, the Armenian, the Greek Orthodox, and the Eastern Orthodox. And so there are a handful of sites, we're going to talk about one a little bit later, where all 4 churches have their own segment in one building. But most of those churches would be coordinated or overseen by one of those 3 or 4 groups: Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Eastern, Greek, or the Roman Catholic. Yeah, and which one of them controlled that one, I really do not remember. Okay. Okay. Via Dolorosa means in English the way of suffering. And the Via Dolorosa is the traditional path that Jesus took from the time that Pilate tried him and finally convicted him to Golgotha. And its distance is a distance of about 2,000 feet, so almost a half a mile. If you do the Via Dolorosa in the order that Jesus did it, you are going to be walking uphill the entire way through the city of Jerusalem. Our last time there, for example, we had a lot of older people, and they didn't want to walk uphill the whole way, and so our guide dropped us up at the top of the hill, and we walked the Via Dolorosa downhill the whole way, but we did make all the stops, okay? So, go ahead.
Via Dolorosa, Via in Spanish
Right.
is the way,
Right.
and Dolorosa means painful.
Painful. Yeah, the way of suffering. There you go.
Dolorosa means painful.
Thank you. We get a Spanish lesson here today. Yes, okay, good. Okay, so what are the stops on the Via Dolorosa, on the way of pain? And again, this is tradition. All of these things happened along the way, but we don't know exactly where they happened. But it's very sobering to be walking through the old city of Jerusalem and remembering the steps that Jesus took and what happened. So step number 1 is where Jesus is condemned to death. Step number 2, the first stop, is where he's carrying his cross. Step number 3 is where he falls the first time. Step number 4 is where he meets his mother. Number 5 is where Simon of Cyrene offers or gets commandeered to carry him into service. Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. He falls the second time. He meets the women. Falls for the third time. His clothes are taken away. He's nailed to the cross. And so each of these specific mentions that was made in Scripture has a stop along this way that is referenced. And the very, very devout Catholics, for example, that would have a very strong belief that the Catholic Church had all this figured out and they had it all right, then each of these stops, there would be a special service or a special prayer. I'm not so concerned they've got all the stops right, but I do know that all those things did actually happen in the story. Yes. The stations of the cross. The stations of the cross is what they, and so there would be a time, even particularly here in South Jersey, but maybe other places, they would stop at each of the stations of the cross and read one of these scriptures. Yes, exactly. And that's what it's based on, this Via Dolorosa. Yeah. So this was station number 5 right here, right in the old city, and this would be marked. And so the Via Dolorosa today, it covers several of the quarters. And so on your walk, you're walking through Muslim quarter, you're walking through Jewish quarter, you're walking through the Catholic quarter, you're walking through the Armenian quarter. And so, kind of just everybody minds their own business. And I've never felt any more threatened there than I would at any large area where you've got a bunch of people. And I don't know if I have a picture. Yeah, this is a very empty sidewalk here. Imagine maybe 20 times that many people being here. So usually when we're at the Via Dolorosa, and again, we're going a little bit earlier this year, so it may not be quite as crowded with tourists. And it depends what day we're there. There are a lot of variables that can change the crowds. But there will be vendors out with their the things that they're marketing on both sides of the path. And then lots of people, and you're mixing the locals with the tourists. And if you want to buy meat, you can buy meat. If you lamb is a popular one. If you want to buy a chicken, you can buy your chickens. If you want to buy a scarf for women or leather for people to wear, these are all. It's like a big mall inside of an old city. It's like a Berlin farmer's market or a Cowtown for those of you who are from South Jersey. But this is the Via Dolorosa today. So there will be stretches that there's nothing there. It'll just be an empty walkway. But then there will be others that walk right through the marketplace. Okay. I mentioned earlier 2 traditional sites or 2 possible sites for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or the church where Jesus was buried, and they would even say that it was very close to the church the place where Jesus was crucified. This one was originally built in 326. It was destroyed and rebuilt 7 times with major reconstructions in 1555, 1810, 1870, and 1997. Again, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And just last time we were there, they were finishing a renovation on the inside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I'm looking here at none of you that are here with us today were on that very last trip. And so there was a major, major renovation done inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this is another one of those churches I was telling Angel about earlier. The Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Roman Catholic, and Armenian. each have their own category inside of this church where their own faith groups would have their own service and their own prayers. So I think that's probably enough. I'm almost hesitant. Remember to show you this next slide. Remember the picture I showed you of the cave in Bethlehem, the traditional site where Jesus was born, and there were people literally on their hands and knees kissing that spot? Well, this is a little bit like that as far as what has happened to it. This is, according to some traditions, the actual site where Jesus was crucified, right above this. And this is what where the Catholics claim that Jesus was crucified and resurrected right near here. And while I appreciate the artwork and the decorations, it made me, I'll just tell you the truth, it made me feel very, very uncomfortable because it borders on idolatry. It's like such a holy, sacred place that is hallowed, and it seems to be a violation, in my way of thinking, of 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 4, where Hezekiah removed the holy places because they were worshiping the things rather than the one who made those things or who created those things. Oh boy, I'm just looking. Hey, we're doing okay for time. I just looked at my watch, though. I didn't have my timekeeper here today. So next time, class number 8, what we're going to do, we're going to move out of Jerusalem, 2 weeks in Jerusalem, or 2 different classes in Jerusalem. Next time, we're going to move into Galilee, the Roman influence, Sepphoris, the Mount of Beatitudes, Capernaum, Church of the Multiplication, where Jesus traditionally multiplied the 5 loaves and 2 fish to enough to feed the thousands. We'll stop at Nazareth, that Jordan baptismal site, and we'll visit the city of Nazareth first and then the church there. So we'll talk a little bit about that for next time. I think that's all we need for today. Questions or comments? Anybody? Thank you for being here. Thank you for your participation. And again, Debbie, Joanne, everybody else that may be watching, thanks for tuning in. Yes, all righty.